Come, take a walk with us through historical Pultneyville. We will take you on a seasonal walking tour that contains photos from 1864. You will meet some of the people of Pultneyville up close, as well as one from the past. Slip on those walking shoes and come along.
And Chester will walk with the Pultneyville tour from Gates all through Pig Lane to the shore. And the tether of tales will fill our minds with the War of 1812 and Captain True.
Chester Peters. I am the teller of tall tales and the maker of tall clocks. Also, I'm the historian for the town of Williamson. Come on, why don't you just go with me and we'll take a little walking tour of the village of Pultneyville.
Today we find ourselves sailing on the shore of Lake Ontario at Pultneyville, which is one of the 3 hamlets that lie within the township of Williamson. This site where Salmon Creek enters Lake Ontario has been used for many years by people who have been interested in lake trade. It was first used by the French in the late 1600s as a stopping place to trade with the Indians, Pultneyville being at the end of an old Indian trail. Later it was used by the early settlers. The post road, being built in the early 1800s from Canandaigua to Pultneyville, was right after the establishment of the first post office here in 1806. Now let us go over to Centennial Park.
Centennial Park was a gift of the land agent here in 1825. Prior to that, in 1824, he'd given approximately 1-acre site up in what is now Lakeview Cemetery, on which the settlers could build a church. But the settlers, figuring that the village was going to be nearer the waterfront, decided not to pick up the option, and so they wanted to build their church down here nearer what they figured was going to be the village. So he gave them this park, which is approximately 1 acre of land, in 1825. Here we have in the park on the west side what was known as Williamson School District Number 1. It was the first district within the town. It was first constructed here on the site back in around 1808. And that was the old wooden building which burned in 1816. It was rebuilt, and it was large enough at that time to house 100 students. So there must have been a sizable population in the area. This present structure was constructed around 1845, and it was used just about 100 years. It was in the mid-1940s when they centralized and joined the Williamson Central School District. Prior to that, there were only 4 or 5 grades that were here for several years, the older children all going to Williamson. Since the mid-1940s, this has served as a residence up till the present day in 1988. Gates Hall sits on land that was leased from the park back in 1892, so their 100-year lease will soon be running out. Originally, it was built on the park as Union Church back in 1826 and used as a church until the Methodists built their own sanctuary in 1874. For a number of years, it was just used as a community hall. Lecturers spoke here. It was used for community events such as plays. It was used for an auditorium for School District Number 1. But the building fell in disrepair. and there was a public drive put forth in 1892, and enough funds were generated at that time to remodel the hall. Previous to that time, there was no basement under it, so it was raised and a basement installed, and 18 feet was added on the rear of the building for a stage. So what used to be Union Church at that time became Gates Hall. And the reason it was called Gates Hall was that one of the larger contributors was Miss Mary Gates. And now each summer, for one thing that we're certain of, that there's usually a Gilbert and Sullivan production put on here at the time of homecoming, the third weekend in July. The Reformed Church here, formerly known as the Dutch Reformed Church, was constructed in 1872 by Rufus Moses, one of the local builders. The reason it was the Dutch Reformed Church, there was a big influx of Dutch settlers in the mid to the end of the 1800s, and so holding to their old tradition, they all wanted a Dutch Reformed Church. Previous to building this structure, they met in a chapel down here at the end of Salmon Creek Road, that chapel being moved from East Williamson, where it was formerly used as a Presbyterian church.
The Methodist Church was constructed in 1874. Up to that time, the Methodists used Union Church. Back in the 1840s, the Methodists purchased a plot of land where the corner store now stands, and they thought it undesirable and moved up Hamilton Street about 500 feet and purchased a lot from John Creighton, the local carriage maker, and built on the present site. The corner store was originally constructed by Russell Smith in the late 1920s as a gas station. The Smith family were old residents, and his grandfather at one time ran the Pultneyville Hotel. He was also a lake captain. The store has been the scene of many community activities. Russ Smith was a local band leader, and for many years the Pultneyville band met under his direction and practiced in the corner store.
This was the residence of Rufus Moses, who was the local builder. He built the Reformed Church. He did the woodwork on the Waters house, the cobblestone house, which is up on the West Lake Road. Later he moved to Sodus, and he built many of the buildings in the village of Sodus. Some of them were the Presbyterian Church and the Opera House and some of the larger homes. But one of the strange things is that Rufus always came back to Pultneyville for his lumber, because most of his lumber came in here into the harbor by ship from Canada. Rufus was quite a character. I've heard some of the old-timers tell that when he was sitting at the table, someone would say, have any salt or have any pepper, Ruf? And he'd say, hell no. He said, I don't need any pepper, I married one. You see, he had married Liza Pepper, the daughter of old Deacon Abraham Pepper here from Pultneyville.
Now our tour will enter the historic district, which comprises about 30 structures.
This is the AUCHANPAUGH house, built around 1850. The AUCHANPAUGHs were old residents here, and they at one time had a harness shop and a drugstore down on the waterfront. The house has been changed quite a bit. The front porch here at one time had a railing above it going all across the roof, and it had clapboards on and blinds, and it had pilasters on the corner and brackets under the cornice. These have all been removed during modernization periods.
This is where Roy Angelo lives today. In the 1867 photo we have of this structure, it was known as the Fish family home. And if you notice the chimney on the left side, you will see Captain Throop's steam sawmill down on the slip next to the Yacht Club house. This house was the home of a local fisherman, Leon Boss. In the 1920s, he caught sturgeon, shipping them to New York City and receiving as much as $1.50 a pound when other fish were selling for 5 cents a pound.
This is what was known as the inner harbor here. The small lake schooners used to come up to this warehouse to load and unload. That was Pallister's warehouse, built in around the late 1850s. If you notice the height of it, it was high enough so that this is the bridge that passes over Mill Street. If you notice the rise here on either side where the bridge is, that was FORMAN Dam. The dam which was constructed by the land company back in 1805 by Samuel Throop, who later became the father of Captain Horatio Nelson Throop, the famous navigator that came from Pultneyville. This dam was breached around 1825, and a new dam was built further upstream. At the time this dam was functioning, there was a mill on either side of the creek. On one side there was a grist mill, and then on the other side a sawmill. And it's interesting to note, as you look at the old account book of Samuel Throop, you can tell when the various families came to town and what stage they were in building their home, their barns, or even building some of their furniture. This is the site here where Mill Street passes over the old dam, which was constructed in 1805.
We have a number of comparison shots of this site. One is the same scene as it was in 1864. Another as it was in 1908. If you will look in the flat where the mill pond was, you will see where the old foundry and later Derby's machine shop was located. Also around 1826, the old cider mill and vinegar factory was constructed and used to around 1900. The Salmon Creek house was formerly the home of the Dunning family, constructed in the 1860s. Prior to that, the property was in the possession of the Pallister family, who lived next door. The Dunnings were sailors. In fact, some of them went whaling with the Roy's family from Pultneyville. The Salmon Creek house is an example of some of the only mercantile activity that is left in the community. We find this in the commercial zone, which is from the corner store around to the firehouse on Washington Street. This is the home of Captain John Pallister, who was a whaler, as were many of the early villagers. Captain Mervyn Pallister and his brother Albert were his sons. They owned the vessel, the Fred L. Wells, with Pultneyville its home port, and they also owned the warehouse. On the lake end of Mill Street, we have several homes. The one in the foreground was Captain William Lever's home, and this was the home of Captain Mervyn Pallister.
This is the CRAGGS mansion, built by the local miller, James CRAGGS. His mill was not here on Mill Street, but it was up on the corner of Salmon Creek Road and Hamilton Street. He was a local miller here for many years, and when he constructed this place, he sent to England for 2 carpenters to do some of the more delicate work on the inside. If you notice here, above the windows, you see the lintels, and you see the windowsills, and you see the water table there, limestone that come into the area here by boat from St. Catharines, Ontario. The bricks coming in from Canada, also by boat. The DeMarree family bought this property back in the late 1930s, and they have lived here ever since. They've made many improvements on the grounds, done a great deal of landscaping, and kept the old house just as it always was. Pig Lane has a distinctive name. I would say that it's probably one of the only few streets in the country with a name as that, such as that. Here we have residence on Pig Lane. This is the only residence in the village that has the distinctive address of Pig Lane. It formerly was Captain Throop's ice house. and it was moved here and made a residence in the early 1900s. Many times the question is asked, why Pig Lane? And so as near as we can figure out, you would see the places over on Washington Street all back up to Pig Lane. So the residents all face Washington Street. The barns were at the rear of the residence, and the pig pens were on the rear of the barn. So when you walk down this public right-of-way that went from J Street to Mill Street, you would be in the company of all the pigs of the people who lived on Washington Street.
As we come down Pig Lane, we find the property of the late Captain THROOP. His barn and backyard are much the same as they were 100 years ago. But the ice house has been moved next door, and the pigs are missing.
One of the more historic spots that back up to Pig Lane is the Captain John Palmer home, which we see here. This was one of the stopping places in the Underground Railroad. But as we look at this place here, it wasn't always this way. If we notice the frontispiece on the rear of this home, formerly that faced the street, or Washington Street. Around 1860, the house was turned around and the brick portion was put on the front. Captain John Palmer was one of the prominent lake captains, and he was active in the lake shipping. Therefore, he was one of Captain THROOP's men who used to take the fugitive slaves and take them from the pier here in Pultneyville across Lake Ontario into Canada and freedom.
This scene has no significance. It is not an archaeological dig or no ancient stone monument such as Stonehenge, but the almost end result of a sewer project. The BORNARTH home at the corner of J Street and Pig Lane was the home of Samuel Owens. In the 1867 photo, this portion was moved back and turned, and the new two-story portion added to the front.
The Henry Griffin house is an old residence on J Street. Henry Griffin was a local merchant having a store over on the waterfront. We have a number of pictures taken of this residence back in 1872. And if you compare these old photographs with the building as it is today, you'll see that it has changed very little.
The home of John and Carol Selsey at the time of this 1867 photo was the home of Thomas Quaife, stage driver for Wells and Gates Line from Palmyra to Pultneyville. The old Arnold Dunning home at the northwest corner of Pig Lane and J Street is now the home of Dr. James and Ann Burke. This is looking down J Street to the site of the old cobblestone blacksmith shop.
The Jeremiah Selby house at the corner of J Street and Washington Street was initially started construction about 1808 by Jeremiah Selby, who came over to Pultneyville from Palmyra and started a mill. We know this house was completed by 1814 because during the Battle of Pultneyville in the War of 1812, which occurred here in Pultneyville in 1814, this house on the front northwest corner took a cannonball. This cannonball is still in the house and today rests on the mantel in the living room.
Can you imagine this home any color than white? In restoration work, it was found to have been red, gray, and buff or cream. This is an old photo of Aaron Brewer's old cobblestone blacksmith shop that stood at the end of J Street.
Today this is the home of the Sillicks. The original part of the house, it is believed, was constructed back in 1816 or 17 by the son of the local clergyman, Reverend Davenport Phelps.
Fairbanks Point is the point which lies about 2.5 miles east of the village, and is the last point you see jutting out in the lake. It bears the name of the first clergyman to come to the area. He was given 100 acres of land by the land company on the point to come and preach for 2 years. Following Fairbanks in 1812, Reverend Davenport Phelps came under the same program and was given 100 acres west of the Fairbanks tract. Phelps became an Episcopal clergyman following his release from his internment in Canada, having been captured during the Revolutionary War in the Boston area. Many of the Episcopal churches in western New York were formed under his direction. He died in 1813 and is buried in Lakeview Cemetery. The BURCROFF home has been remodeled many times and is much different today than it was when it served as the customs house. It was at the foot of the old landing that was used as a wharf until the 1860s. That landing was large enough to drive a teaming wagon out on and turn around at the end and return to shore. This dock was used for many years to refuel the steam vessels with wood, and many a fugitive slave was sent to Canada and freedom from this wharf. The middle house, also a BURCROFF home, was the site of the local barroom called the Pig's Ear. Being close to the base of the pier, it was easy access for sailors stopping in port to load and unload. The Russell Jack home has just been the scene of an extensive remodeling and restoration job and adds much to the beauty of Washington Street. The Captain John Palmer home looks much different from Washington Street than it does from Pig Lane. Early on it had a front stoop. Then in the 1890s a front porch was added. In the late 1930s it was removed, and the present frontispiece was designed and installed under the direction of the late Donald Farragher, a Rochester architect and summer resident of Pultneyville. The 1867 photo of the home looks much as it does today. Here we are at the doorstep of the Lucille Lockley residence, the former Mann home. Mrs. Mann was the postmistress for many years, and if you will notice the brass slot in the blue front door, you will see the old letter drop for the post office. The open space between the old Beardsley and the Mann home at one time was the site of the Pallister boot shop. The old Beardsley home has changed very little. We read in the old commercial press, the Pultneyville monthly paper, that Zenius Burnell, the owner in 1860, was in the process of remodeling this home. What you see now is the result of that restoration. A local doctor, Dr. Beardsley, lived here for many years. We think that Dr. D.C. Higgins originally built the home before 1820. The Washington Troop home, as near as can be determined, was built in 1828. He was the younger brother of Captain H.N. Troop. This home also had a front porch installed in the 1890s, and it was removed in the 1920s.
The home of Captain Horatio Nelson Troop was constructed in 1832 under the supervision of his brother, Washington Troop. This is one of the finest examples of cobblestone architecture in western New York. The cobblestones that the house was constructed with were picked up on the shoreline just west of the village here in Pultneyville.
While his home was being built, Captain Troop was in Cleveland, starting the Cleveland Forwarding Company. One of the mysterious features of this home is that there were witches' bottles built in the living room ceiling. He built ships here locally. One of his last was the Magic, his personal steam yacht, completed in the late 1860s. After his death in 1884, it was sold to a group in St. Vincent and used as an excursion boat on the St. Lawrence River until 1915. He was interested in wind power and built and patented wind machines. His greatest achievement was the developing of a screw propeller that worked efficiently as early as 1833. One of his early models shows a windmill on a deck of a ship operating a screw propeller. For many years he was involved in the Ontario Steamship Company. This placed him in a position to be an effective agent in the Underground Railroad, and he was responsible, like many others on the shore of Lake Ontario, for the transportation of the fugitive slaves to freedom. The old first floor was a general store, and the second floor was used for the Knights of the Good Templars Lodge Hall, a temperate. The Robert Valore home was an early residence, number of structures having been on this site. The last store on the site burned in the late 1960s and is now the site of the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Hawthorne. The old hotel that originally stood on this site was started back around 1809 by Russell Whipple. The original hotel was added to over the years, and it burned in 1887. The building we see here was constructed in 1888 and has changed very little since then, except a roof has been put over the second floor porch. The original hotel was used for many community activities. Up on the third floor there was a sprung floor which was used for a dance hall. And this was the scene of the sailors' farewell in the spring and the sailors' return in the fall. The Sailors' Monument here was erected in 1935 as a WPA project. Here on this plaque here we have the names of the various vessels, and we have the name of the captain and the year here in which the vessel was commissioned. If you notice the stones, they're a bit different here. The stones that the monument was constructed with come from over on the Stony Lonesome Road. And over in that area, the forest was all burned off in order to clean up the fields. And in so doing, there was enough humus so that the fire was quite warm, and it cracked all the stones. So you have all these flat edges on all these stones. The plaque here on this side of the monument commemorates the War of 1812. Originally, this was on a huge boulder at the end of J Street. This boulder sat on a concrete base, but it was washed in the lake during the period of high water back in 1943. It was removed from the boulder and then taken up here and placed on this monument. In May 1814, the British were observing the coastal towns along the south shore of Lake Ontario. After stopping at the mouth of the Genesee, they worked their way east, stopping at Ontario and taking 2 men on board to show the way to Pultneyville. Sunday morning, May 15, 1814, as the militia, under the direction of General Swift, were on maneuvers at the intersection of J and Washington Street in a dense fog, the fog lifted and the British fleet came into view lying off the port. Contact was made, and the citizens were assured safety and the sparing of property in exchange for the stores in the public warehouse. The agreement was honored until a British seaman stepped out of line and was shot by a fellow seaman. This commotion caused a volley of shots to be exchanged. The British retreated to their vessels. Then they began shelling the village. But for some unknown reason, they suddenly stopped shelling and headed down the lake. During this encounter, the only casualty was the British seaman. 2 of the settlers were taken prisoner and were transported to Halifax, being returned shortly after some negotiations were made. The beach house here, as this is often referred to, the house on the monument, sits right on the public right-of-way here. This park here is the extension of Mill Street. For many years, this was the home of the local cobbler, Mr. Isaac Fisher. Later, his son lived in this house. It was Dr. Fisher, and he was noted for the book of poems that he wrote. It says Niagara and Other Poems was the title of the book. The federal government early recognized the value of a good harbor along the south shore of Lake Ontario. And as early as 1829, money was appropriated for the Army Corps of Engineers to design a breakwall here for this harbor.
Not much was done until about the 1850s and 1860s. Then there were some 2,000 foot of pier constructed here. Over here on the west side, where you see the stones laid up on there, the foundation for that is the base of the old West Pier. It went out there about 400 foot, and then it dog-legged and went out in the lake and went at, parallel to the East Pier over here on the east side. This formed a pretty good harbor. In 1892, the federal government put some white oak sheet piling in order to keep the channel open by trying to create a swift current. The port was closed in that year, in 1892, so that project was never completed. And so after that, everything fell in disrepair, and in the early 1930s, the caps were taken off the pier by the Corps of Engineers, and everything has deteriorated ever since.
Now that we have been around the circuit, I am going home and sit on the porch, and you can imagine what a historic place Pultneyville is. Now that I have rested, let's look at some of the scenes outside the historic district. Originally, Lakeview Cemetery was just a small plot, with the first interment being made in 1806. Today it has grown to 12.5 acres. The Waters Cobblestone home was built by Zimmery Waters in 1851 at the cost of just over $350. The Pultneyville Masonic Lodge was formed in 1811 and at that time met in Russell Whipple's old hotel down on the waterfront. The new Pultneyville Fire Hall was constructed in the late 1970s. The Pultneyville Yacht Club was formed in the mid-1940s, with Gordon Tompkins being the first Commodore. It has grown to about 150 craft since that time. The mill at the corner of Salmon Creek Road and Hamilton Street was the old CRAGGS mill. For many years it used water power. Later it used steam, but the old mill pond was used for the production of ice important to the shipping of fruit from this area. In the 1920s, a new dam was constructed and the mill rebuilt to generate electricity. This project soon ended in financial trouble and power production ceased. The mill was demolished as a hazard in the 1940s. Samuel Valore's dried fruit business increased until the warehouse at the old general store on the waterfront was no longer large enough to handle the business, and a new and larger building was constructed at the corner of Hamilton and J Streets, and today it is used for an antique shop. Samuel Ledyard started building his home at the east end of Washington Street in 1809, while his family were living in the corn crib of the land agent. He soon started a forwarding business and had a warehouse on the beach. He was one of the first postmasters. Also, he was a chief negotiator with the British during the War of 1812, writing the Articles of Capitulation on his top hat while being rowed out to meet the British commander, Yale. He was an early nurseryman in the area, and the family home hosted a set of the Bay of Naples wallpaper applied in 1817 for many years. The Todd family of Rochester, descendants of Ledyard, sold the home around 1970, and the wallpaper was still in reasonable condition and sent to the museum in New York City to be preserved. Jacob Washington Hallett was the local land agent for the Pulteney Land Company. For his services, he was given 1,000 acres where the village now stands. His home was started around 1806 and has been added on to many times over the years. Forman Park was one of the areas that was quite active at an early date. It was the home of Samuel CUYLER, who was a member of the New York State Senate back in the 1850s. He was a temperance man involved in the temperance movement at a very early date. Back in the 1830s and 40s, he was also a strong abolitionist and did much for the unfortunate Negro. He was a friend of Griffith Cooper, who was in Williamson, who was also involved in the Underground Railroad. His home stood here until the early 1920s when it was destroyed by fire. Then the Forman family from Rochester purchased the area and started Camp Forman. They used this as a summer home for a number of years. As family interests changed, it was offered to Wayne County as a park, if the county would maintain it as it has to this day. For your enjoyment, we have a number of photos of some old family members of the community. Though no names will be given, I am sure they are representative of any family of the period. Can you recognize anyone? They will have their place in the long list of people whose names are dented in our minds forever. I regret to say that since the making of this video, Fred at Peter DeMarie, who drove 2 generations of children to school.
I think it was the best place that anybody can be. It's right down here. Kids, Lanny, we'd go down there and he'd let us take a little rowboat, you know, and play around the creek with it. Never let us go out in the lake with it or anything. And land, we used to have so much fun. We got so if there was any wind, we'd cut a burlap bag and nail it on 2 sticks and hold it, stand in the boat and hold it up and let the wind push us along. So, them things you don't forget.
John DeManda will introduce us to the spirits in his home.
I mentioned a letter about the house and the spooks in it. We have a letter from Mrs. Stell, who was in there before, and it's a pretty eerie letter. It starts off to address to my grandfather, "Dear Attorney DeManda, this is a letter of consequence." And from there it goes on to describe how her spirit is in the house and it will be coming across the electric wires and how it will be in the furnace door. And so we haven't quite figured out who that spook is, but if it follows from that letter, I'm sure it's Mrs. Stell.
You mean she wrote this letter?
She wrote a letter, yeah. That's a great first line. This is a letter of consequence.
Hazel Peck, a lifelong resident of the area, will tell us a lake story.
Hazel, do you remember the tidal wave?
Yes, very much so.
And do you know what year it was? And what are some of the effects of it?
Well, it was a scary thing. It was early in the morning because I wasn't up, and my mother called us to get up and go and see what was going on. And it drew way, way, way back, and you could see the bottom of the lake. And then when it came in, of course, our house was so close to the water, came right up onto the house and the porch.
Yeah.
And then
that bank is about 25 feet high there, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it was real scary, but it kept, every time it went out and come back, it came back less, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With less force and all. But
well, how far did the water go out?
well, quite a long ways. I wouldn't know just how far. Maybe from here to the road or something like that.
From the shore?
From the shore.
Yeah.
And of course the stones rolled, and it was muddy looking and all. And it was just an awful scary thing for me, for I was a kid, and I thought, what is it going to do to us?
We are now at the residence of Frederick Cornwall. We will visit him and see what he has to tell us of old-time Pultneyville.
Fred, your grandmother was Evelyn Cornwall's wife, was a Pallister.
Oh, yes.
So she was a sister then of CAPT Captain Pallister, Captain Mervyn Pallister, and Albert Pallister. So you must remember these fellows quite well.
Oh yes, very well. Remember sitting on Uncle Albert's knee, he taught me how to tie a bowline knot. Of course, I remember Cap Pallister when he had his boat livery, and we'd go down and borrow his boats and row, taught us how to row.
Yeah, he had a boathouse where he kept those boats that he rented out back of where the warehouse is now.
Yeah.
So, can you remember anything about those fellows? Any particular instances, any peculiarities they had or anything that might be of interest?
Well, they always had stories to tell.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
And of course, we believed them implicitly. As I look back on it now, the stories must have been part fiction and part not. But I remember their explanation of why Aunt Libby's face was paralyzed. And the reason was that she went on her honeymoon with her husband whaling out in Labrador. And all the sailors on board the boat thought that was very bad luck. But they warned her never to look at the midnight sun through a spyglass, which she did. And as the story goes, that paralyzed her face. And that was the explanation that I was given as to why she had a strange face.
And now we're going to speak with Frank Montondo, who has the distinction of being born in the only house on Pig Lane.
Who are some of the characters around town? Do you remember some of them?
Old Sammy Hamilton, old Scotty,
Yeah.
you call him?
Yeah.
He lived up to BURCROFF.
Yes.
And he used to like to drink pretty good. That was one of the things too when we were kids. He'd have us go down here to Fred Hart's store, but Fred Hart finally got smart and he wouldn't sell us tracks, you know. And Fred finally found out what was happening to that stuff. He wouldn't sell it to us anymore.
Fred thought your mother was doing
Yeah, sure. See, and then all of a sudden it dawned on him what was going on. Well, Scotty would probably could buy a bottle of this stuff for 50 cents. He'd give you $1, you know. Boy, you couldn't make 50 cents any easier. And then another one would go uptown and to the drugstore and get rubbing alcohol for him. And especially on 1 cent sale, we'd clean up good then, you know.
What did he do with the alcohol, the rubbing alcohol? Take it right through a loaf of bread?
No, he drank it right straight. He usually would put it into some cider, sweet cider or something like that. But I've seen him, boy, oh boy, he'd pour it in a cup and he'd be shaking so, and he'd get it up to his mouth, you know, and that first swallow just about killed him. And from then on, it would go down so smooth.
We will now visit with Raymond Walvoord, one of the early members of the Yacht Club and a builder of one of the first lightnings in Pultneyville, who will relate some stories about Fred Plashy.
But anyway, my mother would transport him to Williamson to do his banking. And he had a habit, he'd be chewing tobacco and he'd roll the window down a little bit on his side and he'd spit out that window. Well, it wouldn't all clear the car, of course. My mother would sputter some when she got back.
Well, he also used to do that in church. Don't you remember? He used to chew in church, and he sat way down near the front, and there was a cold air draft in the aisle, and he used to spit in the cold air draft during church once in a while.
I don't remember that.
Oh, yeah, I remember that because I remember him talking about it. What a dirty habit that was. But
Richard Parker, proprietor of the corner store, will relate some of his womanizing days in Pultneyville.
Oh, there used to be dances over here to Gates Hall. We'd have a lot of fun over there, and then just a couple miles down the road there was a place called Howland's Cove that we had a lot of fun. We'd go down and chase women around and watch them dance and have a lot of fun down there.
Bill Lergner and C.R. BURCROFF are going to give us some insight how Boy Scouts used to act.
I can remember one year the Boy Scouts or the Cub Scouts were up at Table Rock camping up there. He'll remember this because he was with us. I don't remember who all was there, but they pulled the stakes on their tents and
We didn't know there were really that many of them. I remember, because then we got in the apple war. They chased us as far as the apple orchards, and then we got in the apple war.
And the gravel pit was there. They were still, I don't know if they still use the gravel pit or not. It's still there. But
luckily we knew our way, because they were pretty upset. Some of them were pretty mad by the time it came up, but we got away from them.
We were hiding under trees, and they'd run by us, and we massacred them. But they were mad at us.
Robert Valore, a longtime resident, will tell us how the barter system worked in Pultneyville.
Every farm had a dried house, and they would take and dry their apples and bring them in to my Uncle Sam's warehouse, and he would pack them and ship them to foreign countries, Germany, England, France, and then at the end of the season, they would come in and figure up as to how many dollars they owed for their groceries for the summertime and how much he owed them for the butter and eggs and the dried apples, and then they would settle up.
LUCILLE Lockley, a Pultneyville native, was a teacher in the local school and a successful real estate agent. She is also a loyal Republican.
Now, can you remember, like, when Kennedy was shot? Can you remember that? Yeah, can you remember anything outstanding about that? What happened at that time?
No, I don't know what I am thinking of. No, I can't remember where I was. But I can remember when, listen, I can remember when, not Kennedy, I remember when Prince Edward abdicated.
Oh, yes, that was back in the 30s.
That was
37.
Oh, that was I can't remember.
Yeah.
I'm not a Democrat. I can't remember.
You think that has something to do with it?
I think that has something to do with it.
Now, you can take that two ways. That you aren't interested in what the Democrats did, or that Republicans don't have as good a memory as the Democrats now.
Well, I don't want to inflict that on the Republicans. Oh. They have trouble enough.
Yeah. Pearl, pass the molasses cookies.
I think probably the one I make most often would be molasses cookies, because I can do those without a recipe, and I can do a big batch or a small batch in a hurry, and always seem to have requests for them.
David Cooper, who lives in the old Pultneyville school, will introduce us to a real colorful Pultneyville figure, a character that could have stepped out of one of his Gates Hall productions.
The guy next door, his name was Tex Crandall, and I thought he was the greatest person on the face of the earth. He would do anything for anybody. But he helped us move in here. I didn't even know who he was. Let's see, Gracie was, I don't know where she was, but we brought the truckload of stuff down here. And Steve and I, no, Steve was in the service. Pappy and I were trying to move stuff in, and Pappy wasn't in very good shape. And this guy comes over and says, "I'll help you." And he moved stuff in here. He told us where this would look nice and where this would look nice. And finally, I said, well, who are you anyway? He said, "I'm Tex Crandall, your next door neighbor." Well, we got to be real good friends. And he used to come here almost every day. He'd bring vegetables to Gracie. And he'd say, "Now, Mrs. Cooper, you must take these vegetables, for if you don't, I'm going to give them to the pigs." And she'd say, "Well, we wouldn't want that to happen." Would we, Tex? And he'd say, "No, ma'am, we wouldn't want that to happen." But he was really, I used to go over there, and, well, he drank a lot, but that was okay. I used to go, I like to sit and just talk to him. For he worked, almost every sentence he says started with for. For he worked for Fred Cornwall, and for he was the custodian of the building. And when we first started using the Gates Hall, in order to turn on the water, you had to dig up a hole in the front yard and find the shut-off valve and turn that on. That was Tex's job. It was also his job to put up the flag every day, and he always liked to make sure that somebody was, I would stand out there in the park and applaud him and salute. He thought that was great. Tex Crandall, one of my favorite people.
This is one of our local artists, Judy Burgdorf, painting in one of her favorite spots. A great deal of time and effort has gone into this production. It has been done not only for your enjoyment, but to give the viewer a sense of the rich heritage. While the production may seem provincial, I am sure it is typical of any small hamlet, USA, if we only stop, investigate, listen, and look. Thank you for joining us.